Okay, I think we're live here. Everything looks good on my end. Welcome. This is the Global Freshman Academy HST 102 live chat with me. I'm the instructor and designer of the course, Ian Moulton, and I got a lot of great questions from the group. It's interesting. We've been doing this course for a couple of years, and every time we do it, we do these live chats and we have questions and so on. This is the first time I've gotten so many personal questions, so, about me. So I will address those. I'm going to start with the more sort of content-based ones and then work as we get to the end of our chat to sort of questions about what drew me to this kind of work and things like that. So first we'll deal with the sort of more content-based stuff, and then I'll talk a little bit about myself and my own interests. I'm glad to get the personal questions because it's nice to be able to make a personal connection on a course like this, that, you design it and you run it, and there are tons and tons of students, and people are getting access to me through videos and through the material that I created, but they're not getting direct access like you would in a classroom. And so it's nice to personalize things a bit, even at the kind of scale that we're working at. Well, the first question I'm going to address is one of the last ones that was posted to the chat site. And that was, if I had to sort of narrow it down, what one contribution from the three sort of first weeks of the course would I sort of focus on for each of the societies? So what one thing from the world of Egypt, ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, what one thing from Greece, what one thing from Rome? And this is a wonderful question, partly because it doesn't make sense on some level, right? I mean, how can you just say one? I mean, these things are all so complicated. But it is important to try and say, okay, what is the one? It's like asking you, what's your favorite movie? Well, favorite movie what? Favorite comedy, favorite movie to watch with my kids, favorite movie to watch with my friends, favorite movie to watch on my own, favorite movie when I was 20. I mean, what does that even mean, favorite movie? But if you have to think one thing, what's it going to be? Just one thing. That's a very useful intellectual exercise, I think. So I thought about it, and I thought, what one thing? And here are my answers for each of those civilizations. From the world of Egypt and Mesopotamia, the one thing that I would think was the most significant for me, or most interesting, or whatever, is irrigation. And maybe this is because I live in Arizona, and we live in a society here in Arizona today that is absolutely dependent on irrigation. If we didn't bring water from rivers thousands of miles away, we couldn't live where we live. There are issues about this with sustainability. There were issues in the ancient world with sustainability, but irrigation in some ways is crucial to the development of civilization. It was crucial here in Arizona. The reason ASU is, of course, located in the Phoenix metropolitan area, and Phoenix is called Phoenix because the phoenix is a mythical bird that rises from the ashes of the desert. And the fact of the matter is, there was a city here previously, a Native American city that existed from about the 12th to the 14th centuries, and it was fairly large, and it was based entirely on irrigation, on being able to bring water to the fields. The remnants of the old canals exist. In fact, canals that are here now are built on the plan of the ancient canals, following their courses and things like that. Now, there are a couple of interesting things for this. One is that, and this goes for Egypt and Mesopotamia too, one thing is, of course, that, wow, they were able to have cities because of irrigation. They were able to get large numbers of people living together, sometimes in inhospitable environments, because they were able to organize and get water, treat water as not a natural resource, but as a resource that human beings can shape through society and through civilization. This is really impressive and allows a lot of things that wouldn't be possible otherwise because of the concentration of population. The danger, of course, is that, the city that the Native Americans built here died out after a while, and it died out long before Europeans arrived to disrupt it. We don't know what happened, but we can guess from archaeological evidence that the water ran out, possibly because the irrigation was so successful that population levels got too high, even with irrigation for the water. This is a warning for our future, not just in Arizona, but in everywhere in the world where we're dealing with scarce resources. And it also, is very important back in the ancient world of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Now, the Egyptians are in an interesting situation because they have the Nile flood, and the Nile is a natural rhythm and kind of naturally irrigates the land in a way that In Mesopotamia, you have to do it more with canals and more with human intervention. But in both cases, you're using scarce water resources in a desert environment to create a very fertile civilization that produces large amounts of food. And people who study this in detail connect irrigation to the development of political structures. Unless you have a very organized society where you can allocate labor in large, on a large scale, you can't create irrigation. No one farmer or individual family is going to be able to build a huge canal system to get water to their farm. That needs to be done by a larger unit that's looking more on a social level. And people have connected this with the rise of civilization. So irrigation, I think, for the world of Egypt and Mesopotamia. For the Greek world, I think the main thing is what I would call a sort of openness to rational inquiry, whether it's rational inquiry in philosophy, in politics, or in science. One of the things you start to see in ancient Greece is a stress on mathematics. Our word mathematics comes from the Greek word math, which means just learning. This sort of fundamental knowledge about numbers, and numbers not for their mystical significance, like the mystical significance of 3 or 7 or 9 as sort of numbers with power, but numbers used in a scientific sense to calculate things, to be able to measure things. That kind of spirit, but also the spirit in the kind of Socratic spirit you see, where Socrates goes around Athens saying, okay, what qualities should a good person have? Well, they should be brave. Well, what does brave mean? What do you mean by brave? When you say brave, what does a brave person do? Is a brave person always brave? Or are they brave one day? Can you teach children to grow up to be brave? What about honesty? What about, in any words, these things that we all sort of generally agree are good without thinking about them very much? The ancient Greeks start thinking about them, and what is it that makes a person brave? What is it that makes a person trustworthy? And how do you organize people into political groups? How should you organize political power? Should you have 2 people in charge? Should you have a small group of people in charge? Should you have 1 person in charge? Should everybody be in charge? And what does everybody mean? Does everybody mean everybody who's male and over a certain age? Does everybody mean everybody who is male and over a certain age and whose parents are both from this city? Does male mean that you make a certain amount of money, or is it just your biological gender that does, your biological sex that determines this? All of these, the Greeks come up with various solutions to them, and they're different from our solutions, but just the fact that they're thinking about it and they're questioning it and saying, well, why is this good? And you see this in the ancient historians like Herodotus, who goes out and describes Egypt and Persia as sort of alternative societies. And he doesn't always get everything right. He makes a lot of mistakes when he's trying to describe these societies. But just the idea that another society somewhere else might do things totally different from you, and that this might be good, or this might be bad, or this might be just something you don't care for because it's not the way you do it, but you're thinking about it. You're thinking about, why is what we do good? Is it because we do it, or is it because there's actually a logical reason that what we do is more efficient, or the way we do it is more practical or achieves better results? That kind of spirit where you're always sort of looking for the answers instead of assuming that you have the answers because of tradition and because of your superior culture. Everybody thinks their own culture is superior. There's a sort of gross generalization that you can just make about human social groups. If you're in a group, you tend to think that your group's best. Not all the time, maybe, but mostly. And you tend to think that your group does things the natural way and the way that God intended, and so on. And the Greeks believe this about being Greek, and they sort of, are very critical of the barbarians, the people who don't speak Greek and who aren't part of their sort of cultural group. But they're also willing to question, and they're willing to ask, wait a minute, why is it that what we're doing is good? Is there a reason beyond just tradition, or beyond just that it's us? And there's a kind of self-awareness that goes with that, a willingness to question, that I think is very valuable. The Greeks are not the only culture that are doing this, but they do it very well, and they do it very consistently over a long period of time. And they've given future cultures the example of how to do it. And we draw on this in so many ways. So Rome, what would be the one thing that we have from Rome that endures. And I think there are a lot of things that are appealing to me about Roman society. There are a lot of things that are horrifying about it too, of course. But the one thing that I think the Romans did better than anyone else was organization. Structural organization, infrastructure. The course talks about this a bit in terms of building roads, creating strong trade networks, building cities. The Romans have a plan for building a city. You don't just do whatever. You set it up in a certain way with a grid street pattern, and you have a certain number of streets going one way and a certain number of streets going another way, and certain buildings at certain places on the grid, because that's the way to do it, and that's the fastest way to do it, and it's the most efficient way to do it, and so on. That's not the way that, generally speaking, cities were built prior to that. Obviously, the Roman military organization is enormously influential and important, and a lot of their technological and organizational challenges come out of the strength of their military. The city planning is based on the planning of a Roman military camp, which is also set up along a grid in a certain sort of pre-organized fashion. All Roman military camps have the same 4 gates. They all have the same sort of structure, and that passes over into their city planning. Their water, getting back to irrigation issues, they're building aqueducts, they're bringing water places. Cities like Rome and Constantinople couldn't have existed for a day without all sorts of artificial engineered systems for bringing water in and also removing water. The Roman sewers were an engineering marvel. They didn't use the sewers like we tend to think of sewers as getting rid of wastewater from toilets and things like that. That wasn't their main function in Rome. Their main function was to get rid of rainwater, so that when there was a strong rain or the river rose, that the city could be cleared of water, that you wouldn't have floods. That was the main reason to have sewers. But for whatever reason, phenomenal engineering. But the other place the Romans organized was their legal system. And this is primarily achieved under the Byzantines, under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century with the Justinianic Code, where he basically organizes, gets together a team of legal scholars and organizes all of Roman law into this sort of coherent system, which is still used as the basis for the law in a lot of European countries. There's an Anglo-American tradition of law, which comes out of English common law, which is a different legal tradition. But in a lot of places in Europe, even now, the law is based on Justinianic Roman law. And the sort of organizational power to do that is really remarkable. So if I was going to look at the 3 first weeks of the course and say, what are the 3 things that are absolutely crucial and essential, I would say irrigation, a spirit of inquiry, and organization, organizational structures, infrastructure, and so on. There's a lot more. Obviously, you could have another 3, but those are the 3 that I sort of came up with. So that's a nice question for our discussion, because it sort of opens things out. Second question that I wanted to address, and I'm going to take them sort of in chronological order. Got a question about Egyptian polytheism, the Egyptian sort of belief system in all these various gods and so on, and what was my opinion of it, and sort of what was my take on that. One of the things that's hard for us in most of the world today to really get our heads around when we're studying these ancient cultures is that polytheism is the norm almost everywhere. Almost universally, the first example of a monotheistic religion seems to be the Jewish people, who have this notion that there is just one God. And of course, this gets transferred from Judaism to Christianity, where the Jewish God is seen as identical to the Christian God. The difference between Judaism and Christianity largely at its root being one over whether Christ was or was not the Messiah. Christians say yes, Jews say no. And then there's a whole Christian theology. Once you accept or believe that Christ is the Messiah, then that creates a whole new theology around the nature of Christ being the Son of God and being the Savior and so on. And that goes on. But then, of course, the whole idea goes, also the monotheistic idea goes off into Islam, where they rethink Christ and say, no, Christ was a prophet. He was a holy man. He was clearly someone God cared for. But God is God, and God can't have children. God is just one. You can't have multiple gods. There is no God but God, and God is God. So if you look at the world, so much of the world has been influenced by the Christian religion or the Islamic religion. Eastern religions aren't the topic of our course, but Eastern religions too. There's, you know, in Hinduism, there's obviously many, many gods, but there's also a sense in Hinduism of one divine force underlying this, and that there's a kind of unity to the universe in complicated ways. Buddhism also moves towards monotheism, but that's outside the scope of our course. But all of this means that today, if you're a religious person, chances are very good that you believe that there is one God and there's some kind of unifying force underlying creation and the world that we see. There's a unifying spiritual force. In the ancient world, that was not the common belief. The common belief was that there were many, many gods. They were related to each other in various ways. They were related perhaps to the life force or creation in various ways. We tend to assume in monotheistic religions that the one God is the creator God, because if there's only one God and we're living in a creation, then that God must have created it. Ancient religion, no, there can be a creator God who's gone now. They created the universe and they're no longer in it. They're no longer interested, or they were killed by their children, or, you know, they faded away or whatever. And so Egyptian polytheism was a polytheistic religion, like the religions of Mesopotamia, like the religions of the Greeks and later of the Romans. And the thing about polytheistic religions is they tend to be accretive in their organization. In other words, when one polytheistic group encounters another, they don't tend to say, well, our gods are the only gods. They tend to say, oh, you have your gods too, but of course we have ours. And there might be a very often a cultural belief that ours are better. But the other thing that you see happening is a kind of notion, oh, you have a god for the sky. Well, we have a god for the sky. We call him Zeus. What do you call Zeus? In other words, the idea that there's just one sky god, but of course different people in different places have different names for this god, and maybe different stories about what that god's significance is. In Herodotus, the Greek historian, there are passages where he says, oh, yes, we have, of course, there's Aphrodite. And, you know, in Aphrodite, the Arabs call her Alalat. Yeah, they have a belief, and they have this, and the Medes call her this, and so on. And their idea is that, well, there's one goddess of love, but, oh, all sorts of different names and all sorts of different traditions and all sorts of ways that various people think that they should worship. The Greeks are fascinated that the Persians tend to worship in nature instead of having temples. There's all these kinds of differences. Egyptian religion is an enormously complex subject, and obviously this is a society that in some ways philosophically and culturally is very much centered on death and the afterlife and the importance of that. And so in any kind of culture where you think the most important thing that happens to you after you're dead, there's going to be an enormous amount of thought and sophistication of thought around issues of religion, of spiritual powers, of the organization and structure and logic of the afterlife. And Egyptian culture certainly has an enormous amount of lore and belief and tradition around this. It's a mistake to think that I think that monotheistic religions are in some ways more complex or more sophisticated philosophically than polytheistic religions. It depends on the belief system and so on. But the key, I think, in some ways for the course is the notion that monotheism gets invented at a certain point, and it starts off very small, at least in the world that we're studying, the world of the Mediterranean and of Europe. It begins with just the Jewish people, who are a small group of people living sort of on the fringes of that world in some ways, depending on how you conceive it. And that this becomes the main belief in all parts of the Mediterranean European world, whether it's the Islamic South or the Christian North. There is no question that there is one God, as opposed to a multiplicity of gods, and that really is the fascinating historical transformation and ideological and religious transformation too. It's a very different way of thinking about the world. So that's sort of what I think is important about Egyptian religion, is that it has parallels to these other kinds of beliefs that were very common in the ancient world. And that larger question about why human beings have moved over time from a polytheistic, generally being polytheistic, to generally being monotheistic. It's very, it's a fascinating one. It doesn't have any one simple answer, obviously. So next question is one about Greek culture and the spread of Greek culture after Alexander the Great conquers what for him in many ways was the known world. I mean, he starts off in Greece and he consolidates his control over Greece. The Macedonians from the north of Greece had taken over a lot of sort of the heartland of the Greek world under Alexander's father Philip. But then Alexander moves this in an astonishing way to conquer the Persian Empire and to move further east towards India. We know that he got as far as the Indus Valley in what is now Pakistan. And we know that he came in contact with Indian culture there, culture of the Indian subcontinent. He also conquers Egypt, which was, of course, an independent and dominant and very old civilization at that time. And so what's the nature of this conquest? I mean, Alexander has a relatively small army, and it's very much a sort of personal conquest in the sense that he's really doing this on his own. He has an army with him. Of course, you can't conquer very many people without an army, but it's not like there's a big group of powerful people. Alexander is the general and he's the leader. And by the end of his life, he's beginning to ask that people worship him as a god, which was common in the Persian world. He conquers Persia, and the Greeks always resisted worshiping their rulers as gods. They were too skeptical, I think, for that. But in the Persian world, as in the Egyptian world, the pharaoh was seen as godlike. And Alexander, having conquered Persia, demands that he be sort of worshipped as a god, as in fact he was after his death. Then all of a sudden he dies very young. He dies in his mid-30s. Probably after a night of heavy drinking. He lived a pretty rough, wild life. We don't know if he was poisoned. He might have been. He had people who didn't like him. He had people who were afraid of him, obviously. Anyone in his position would. What we know is that nobody expected him to die young. In fact, some people might have expected him, since he was now declared a god, to live an unnaturally long period of time for a human being. But once he was gone, there was kind of a power vacuum, and various generals took control of various parts of the area that he had conquered, and they began to fight it out, and then they established what are known now as the Hellenistic kingdoms. We use this modern term Hellenistic to describe all of these societies and kingdoms and empires that rise up after Alexander. They are called Hellenistic because Hellenes is the word that the Greeks call themselves. And so really it's just a way of saying Greek, but using another word to distinguish it from sort of Greek civilization in Greece before that time. What do these kingdoms have in common? One is that they're kingdoms. They're not democracies. They're run by like Alexander, a single leader who has semi-divine status. The language of administration and of military power and of high culture is Greek. So the ruling class speak Greek. The ethnic mix is incredibly diverse, and this is one of the big changes, because we've seen in the Greek world that Greeks define themselves through their language and to a larger extent their ethnicity. If you spoke Greek, you were Greek. Well, once you get to the Hellenistic period, there are many, many different kinds of people living under Hellenistic rule. Some of them speak Greek, some of them don't. There are people of Arabic descent, there are Jewish people, there are Persian people, there are innumerable ethnic groups, all of whom speak their own languages, many of them not related even closely to, even distantly to Greek. And this is something we need to think about, again, when we look at the ancient world. We live now in a world where the sort of standard model for a country is what's called the nation state. And there are differences on this, and political theorists will, sort of point them out. But basically, the model is one that develops in Europe in the 18th century and 17th and 18th century, which is your country is a kind of unified group of people who ideally, theoretically, in the 17th and 18th century, would have some kind of ethnic kinship. And a good example of this would be France. The idea is that everyone in France is French. They all have a sort of shared heritage. They all speak the same language, French, which is not really spoken anywhere but France. And so the French are French and they live in France. That That's the theory. Now, in practice, this isn't always the case. There are always groups of people in the country who are not ethnically part of the majority ethnic group. There are always people who speak different languages and different dialects. And over time, of course, with immigration from various places, we've seen enormous changes in this. But the model is that the French are French, they speak French, they have a shared cultural and ethnic heritage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's the ideal. In the ancient world, that ideal doesn't really exist in any kind of straightforward way. Rulers rule, and they rule in whatever language that they speak. The Romans were not particularly concerned to make everyone in Roman territory learn Latin. In fact, Rome was a bilingual empire. It was Latin in the West and Greek in the East, even at the highest levels. And most powerful Roman people tended to be functionally bilingual in Latin and Greek. They might not be able to write both, depending on their skill set, but they could certainly understand both to a certain extent. That was very often part of their education at the elite levels. But the key is that there are these elite languages like Latin, which is the official language. Now, there are places like the city where most people speak Latin. They don't necessarily speak the same kind of Latin that's used in written documents. They might speak a more sort of street Latin, but they speak Latin. But if you go out into hill towns around Rome, people there speak other languages. And if you get outside of Italy into North Africa, people speak all sorts of languages. The Romans don't care as long as people pay their taxes and they support the Roman state and the Roman power structure. The Romans don't care as long as they can rule it. They don't care what language people speak. And the same is true of the Hellenistic kingdoms. Greek becomes a language first of the ruling elite, but it's also a language of trade. A lot of traders speak Greek, and people going from one place to another with goods speak Greek. And so Greek becomes a language that's associated with money and political and military power. That means there's incentive for people to learn it. And probably the best example of how this works is actually the early days of Christianity. We know that Jesus Christ, the historical person, spoke Aramaic, and that was the language that was spoken. It was a Semitic language. It's related to Hebrew, but it's not Hebrew. And it was the language that was spoken in the towns and villages and cities of Judea and of the part of the world where Jesus lived. This is the language that he would have learned growing up. He may also have been able to speak and read Hebrew. He may have had a smattering of Greek because he needed Greek to get by in various circumstances. Even though they're being ruled by the Romans, it's highly unlikely that someone in Jesus's sort of socioeconomic position would have learned any Latin beyond a word or two here or there. The administration was mostly in Greek. So Jesus is living and preaching in Aramaic, and when he dies, his last words in the Gospels are related in Arabic or in the untranslated Aramaic. It said, "Well, Jesus cried out and he said this," and the translation into Greek is, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" But the words in the text are given in the Aramaic that Jesus presumably actually said as he was dying. What's interesting about this is the Gospels and the Bible are not in Aramaic. The New Testament of the Bible is all written in Koine Greek, which was the sort of international version of the Greek language, simplified a bit from Attic Greek that was spoken and written in ancient Athens and other Ionic Greek that Herodotus wrote in. It's Koine means common in Greek, and Koine Greek just means common Greek, sort of international Greek. The Gospels are written in Greek. Why are they written in Greek if Jesus spoke Aramaic? The answer is literate culture is in Greek, and that Greek is the language of scholarship. It's an international language too, in the sense that it can be spread widely. People can read it in many, many places all throughout what by then was the Roman world. People can read Greek. And this is quite remarkable if you think about it, because Jesus spoke Aramaic person. His culture was Jewish culture that had a long tradition, of course, of scripture in Hebrew, like the Old Testament Bible. And there's not much question of writing the New Testament in Hebrew. It's written in Greek. And this shows you kind of administrative language and so on. And this is sort of so Greek comes into the Hellenistic world as a kind of top-down thing. But it thrives because of trade and because of connections between cultures and because of its connection to money, power, and so on. And it sort of transmits itself through. The other thing that I think we sometimes underestimate in the ancient world is we often live, especially in the English-speaking world, we often live sort of monolinguistic lives. We speak English, we read English, we assume everyone else should learn English, and really do much not in English. And many people, if that's their sort of natural linguistic habitat, they don't think that it's a normal thing to be able to speak 2 or 3 languages, or only very educated people could speak 2 or 3 languages. But of course, immigrants coming to the United States from Latin America speak Spanish. It's their native language, but then they learn English when they get to the United States, because you won't get very far in the United States without speaking English. And so there's a lot of bilingualism in those communities. Even though those communities are sometimes impoverished, sometimes very marginal, there's still sort of functional bilingualism. And this is the case in the ancient world. If you were, a carpenter living in Nazareth, you would learn Aramaic as your local language. You would speak to your parents in Aramaic. You would speak to your neighbors in Aramaic. But if you were selling your services and goods to a larger community, you might want to have a little Greek so that you could deal with the traders who wanted to buy the things you made in your carpenter shop. And so you would know some Greek as well as Aramaic. If you went to the temple, if you were an observant Jew and you went to the temple, you might know a little Hebrew from your religious practices. So bilingualism and trilingualism, multilingualism is a fact of life in these places. And this is very much the culture of Alexandria in Egypt, which is, as its name suggests, was founded by Alexander the Great, and was an intellectual center. It was famous in ancient times for its great library, and the reason that there's a library in Alexandria is it's a mixing and meeting place of so many different cultures. Jewish culture is not far away. There's the Greek culture of the Ptolemaic rulers, the successors of Alexander, but there's also, of course, Egyptian culture. So there's Egyptian things, and also as Alexandria becomes part of the Roman world after Augustus Caesar defeats Cleopatra, then Egypt also becomes part of a Roman structure where Latin is a valued language. So without even trying very hard, we have 4 or 5 languages that are going to be very important in ancient Alexandria. And so that kind of linguistic mix is key. And just before we go off this topic, it's interesting how this works. In Hebrew scripture, I believe it's in Isaiah, there's a prophecy about how a young woman will give birth to a son who will be blessed by God. Well, that's straightforward enough. When that gets translated into Greek by Jewish scholars who are living in a Greek-speaking world in the Hellenistic period, they translate young woman as Parthenos, which is the Greek word for a young woman. But the other meaning of Parthenos in Greek is virgin, because young women is well-brought-up young women, proper young women very often were virginal before they were married. That was a goal anyway. When that gets into the Christian tradition, the prophecy becomes a virgin will give birth to a child who is blessed by God. Well, that's a much more miraculous event than a young woman giving birth to a child who is blessed by God. And part of that meaning comes in through the Greek word that can mean either young woman or virgin, often means both. Later it's interpreted as virgin. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but my understanding is that the Hebrew word that's used in Isaiah is less specific about virginity and mostly means young woman. But as texts move through this sort of polyglot linguistic environment, they shift their meaning and shift their emphasis. And it's really interesting to see how linguistic and religious beliefs follow these sort of linguistic patterns. So that's just a little taste of a very fascinating issue around that. So I hope that clears up some of the things about the Hellenistic kingdoms. The other part of that question that I want to address briefly is, were the Greeks influenced by other cultures? And yes, they were. One of the problems for sort of Greek historiography from a modern point of view is we tend to look back in Europe and European descended cultures like North America. We tend to look back at the Greeks and say, wow, they were really smart. They must be our intellectual ancestors because we're really smart too. And of course, we would have learned all our great smartness from our brilliant Greek ancestors. And what this tends to do is focus on the brilliance of the Greeks, which is a real thing, and it tends to downplay things that Greeks might have gotten from somewhere else, things that Greeks sort of took from other cultures. And the most important of these is the alphabet, which they get from the Phoenicians, who are a Semitic people living in sort of in the area that is now Lebanon. And the Phoenicians are the first and only people to invent an alphabet, as opposed to some sort of system of drawing words that's connected to their meaning rather than abstract sounds. What an alphabet does, and very, very usefully, is that it connects a symbol not to a word or to an idea, but to a abstract sound that then can be combined with other sounds to make words. And this is far from a kind of self-evident thing. This is a very, very big intellectual innovation. The idea that symbols can represent sounds. The sound doesn't mean anything. It's just a sound. But if you combine it with the sound ah, you can get ma. And if you put another M sound at the end of it, you can get mom. And all of a sudden you have a word using two letters to make a three-letter word, M-O-M. You can now transcribe any sound you hear in any language, which you can't do if you have one character which means mom, which most languages would have, right? Because you're not going to get very far in life without having a word for mom. So one of the things you see is the alphabet creates an enormous, it's a huge communication revolution. It's probably the greatest single advance in communication technology in human history, arguably far more important than computers. Computers are pretty cool and do all sorts of things like enable us to have Google Chats. But if we didn't have an alphabet, we would be in a very different communication environment. The Greeks get their alphabet from the Phoenician alphabet. And that allows them to have a system for writing their language, which is very efficient and is an enormous help in their intellectual, sort of all that intellectual creativity that we saw earlier. But that's something the Greeks get from other people. They didn't invent the alphabet. They stole it from the Phoenicians. And linguists who study this say everybody else stole it from the Phoenicians as well, that it's something that's only been invented once, and that it has traveled, because it's such a self-evidently useful idea, it's traveled now all over the world. But yes, the Greeks did not come up with everything, and they're like any other culture. They were very, they owed a lot to the cultures around them in various ways, to Egyptian culture, to Persian culture, to pre-Greek cultures of the Aegean and things like that. This is an area where my suspicion is more scholarship could be done, because it was something that for a long time people didn't focus on, because they focused on the sort of brilliant achievements of the Greeks rather than where did they get things from. One of the prejudices we have is that to take a good idea from someone else isn't as clever as coming up with it by yourself. And that's not necessarily the case in terms of practical issues. Sometimes you can your intelligence can be shown by what you know, what you recognize as useful and adopt. That can be just as transformative for your life and your society as thinking up something all by yourself. Other questions. We've got lots and lots to talk about. There's a question about women and the status of women. This is an interesting issue. The idea behind the question, I think, was that when the Roman world becomes Christian, the status of women declines in various ways. This is true. It's true in the sense that in under traditional Roman religion, women had a very prominent role in religious observances. The great example at Rome is the Vestal Virgins, who are absolutely crucial religiously to the function of Roman society. Only women can be Vestal Virgins. And Vestal Virgins are not exactly sort of feminist icons. They have to take a vow of virginity. They're often chosen when they're quite young, very often against their will. They don't have a say in it. It's just you're the daughter of wealthy Romans and you're chosen to be one of the Vestal Virgins. 30 years of chastity is required. The pain of breaking this vow of chastity is to be buried alive. Not very nice. But during that time, you're a very powerful priestess. So is that a good life? Or, you know, you can figure it out. But it's a position of power for women. Obviously, the Christian church has no Vestal Virgins. And in fact, the Christian church does not allow women to be priests, certainly not in the period that we're studying. And in some ways, women's roles are reduced. People have pointed out that one of the things about Christianity is that it replaces the traditional trinity of the mother, the father, the mother, and the child. Like in Egyptian religion, you get Osiris the father, Isis the mother, and Horus the child. It replaces it with an all-male or certainly non-female trinity, which is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. There are no women in that group. There are no females in that group. And that in some ways excludes women from the core of Christian divinity. Women, of course, make up half the population in any period, and it's very difficult to sort of entirely exclude women from religion. One of the ways this comes out in Christianity is the cult of the Virgin Mary, especially in the Middle Ages, and the importance of Mary as a sort of intercessor for Christian believers with God. But Mary, of course, is a human woman who is beloved of God and exalted by God, but Mary is not God. There are things about the role of women in Christianity, though, that might have been perceived by individual women and even groups of women in the ancient world as empowering. One is that Christianity is much more open to the salvation of slaves, for example. Christianity is a religion that's very attractive to enslaved populations because it basically says we can't do anything about the fact that you're a slave here and now, but in the kingdom of heaven, you will be equal to anyone because your soul is as good as anyone's soul, man, woman, king, pauper, souls are souls, that God loves all souls equally. That is, in terms of changing people's lives, it doesn't necessarily change their status. In fact, it doesn't change their social status, but they're still slaves. They have a promise of being something better in the next life. They also have the notion that on some level they're valuable, that on some level they are equal, that their masters may not love them, but God does. And God is the ultimate Lord and Master, as we know in this. But so that may provide some benefits. The other thing that you might not think about as a plus for women in the Christian religion is that especially early Christianity very highly praises the notion of chastity. The idea that the highest sort of way to live in terms of your sexual life is to take a vow of chastity and become a holy person who devotes their life to God and just doesn't have sex. Now that to a lot of modern people and to a lot of modern women would seem as a real imposition. What? I have to have no sexual life of any kind? What a horrible thing. Yes. But in the ancient world, very often women had very little control over their sexuality. In other words, they had no control. Slave women obviously had no control, but even wealthy women were often in arranged marriages or were married to unfaithful husbands that they couldn't divorce. Women didn't have a lot of choice in the ancient world over their sexual lives. And what this means is if you are offered the option of chastity as something that is endorsed by the church, then at least you have the freedom to opt out. In other words, you can get out of that crummy marriage that your parents are arranging for you by joining a convent instead and living in a community of women. You have to renounce, at least officially, you have to renounce your sexuality. Do that, but you get other kinds of freedom that you wouldn't have if you went into the horrible marriage with the abusive middle-aged husband that your parents were setting you up with because they wanted access to that person's money. So it's a complicated question, and there are pluses and minuses on both sides. It's a great question to bring up. Looking at other things, we're starting to get to the sort of more personal questions that people asked, and I'm happy to address these. One was there was a student who was saying, what if I'm planning to visit Rome this fall, what should I see? Rome is one of my favorite places, and there's just a ton of stuff to see. One of the things about Rome is that it's a city that is very vibrant and exciting right now, but it also has this sort of very, very deep and layered history that is everywhere visible. There are ancient Roman things, but there are also things from the medieval period. There's the Baroque Rome, all the things that the popes built in the 16th and 17th centuries. It's a magnificent city in terms of culture, on all sorts of levels. If you're interested in the ancient world, The sort of place where everyone starts is the Forum and the Colosseum, which are right in the center of Rome and are still surviving as ruins. You can visit both of them. It's you could spend days exploring both of them, especially the ruins of the Forum and the Palatine Hill, which is right next to the Forum, which is where the imperial palace was in the Roman imperial period. But there are a few other things to think about a little further afield. One of the great places near Rome that's very easy to reach the rail network, just the Roman commuter rail, is Ostia, which was the port city of Rome in the ancient period. And later the river changed and silted up and it was kind of abandoned. And what it is now is it's kind of like a mini version of Pompeii. And in other words, there are miles and miles and miles of ruins and archaeological remains and so on that you can easily spend several days exploring if you want to. And with a fraction of the tourists that are at Pompeii, it's a much less well-known site. It doesn't survive in the same condition as Pompeii because it wasn't sort of buried under ash that preserved wall paintings and things like that. But there are an awful lot of very interesting things to see, and you get the sense of the texture of a Roman city at Ostia without having to sort of fight your way through the very large crowds that are at the Forum and the Colosseum. So that's an interesting option. The other thing from the ancient world that's fun to visit is the catacombs, which are also just outside Rome. You can reach them on public transit, buses, and Ubers, of course, would get you there as well. And these are the Christian tombs in the early days of Christianity. They were not sort of secret hiding places as much as they were the places for Christian burial, and they're fascinating monuments. One of them, just a quick plug for another place. One of my favorite places in Rome is a church called San Clemente, which is not far from the Colosseum. And in San Clemente, there's a beautiful sort of medieval church with some 18th century additions on the sort of street level, and you go in and it's a gorgeous church with beautiful paving stones and cosmati work floor and all these, just a beautiful place. But then if you go down into the basement of the church, you come to a much earlier church, which has been excavated from sort of early Christian times. And if you go down under that to the second basement down, you come to a temple of Mithras, which was a place where sacrifices were given to the Mithras, and the killing of the bull was the central ritual of the Mithraic religion. And one of the things that's great there is you sort of see three levels of religious belief literally stacked on top of each other in the same place. It's a wonderful place to get a sense of the depth of literally the depth of the Roman past, because you're going deeper down in as you go down these different basements. San Clemente is the name of the church. It's a wonderful place, but Rome is full of places that have surprises like that. It's a great city to explore. This gets to another question that someone brought up is, do I travel to the places I study? And the answer is as often as I can. And there are a lot of places that we talk about in this course that I have not traveled to. I've traveled extensively in Italy. I've been to Istanbul in Turkey. I would like to visit more of Turkey. There are a lot of ruins from the classical period in Turkey, the ruins of Troy, the ruins of Ephesus, which was a big city in the Greek period. Fascinating places to visit that I haven't visited. I've never been to Greece. I would love to go to Greece. That's somewhere I've just never quite made it to. It's sort of on my list of places to get to, but I haven't got there yet. I've traveled extensively in France, spent a lot of time in England, especially a lot of time. England and Italy are probably the two European countries that I know best. I've traveled a little bit in Spain. I would love to go to North Africa. I never have. I would love to see some of the Roman ruins there and go to places like Morocco. The other place that I haven't been that I would like to go is Egypt. I have been to Israel, but not since I was quite young, so it would be interesting to go back to that part of the world. I would love to go to Jordan, to Petra, and see the ruins there. Of course, some of these places are sort of not the nicest places to visit in terms of the contemporary politics, but all fascinating. And actually going to places is an interesting way to sort of get a sense. You know, sometimes you can't get very much when you go to the place because what you're going there to see isn't there anymore, and you don't really have a sense of it. But in other ways you can. And, you know, there's something to be said for actually seeing, what did a Roman wall look like? I mean, simple things like that. Even if you're in England and you go to the Roman ruins at Bath, where there are ruins of Roman baths, fascinating thing to do. And this is very much a living thing. Things are still being discovered in these places all the time. One of the great places, of course, to go is Pompeii, where I've been a couple of times. And I would like to get back. So yeah, travel broadens the mind. So that would be great. Someone asked about why I care about, where I got my passion for teaching. I think I grew up in a family of teachers, so it's probably, I joke with people that I'm kind of a university army brat because my dad was a college professor. My mother was a teacher librarian. My grandmother was a teacher. My wife is a college professor. So I kind of live in that world of education in various ways. And I never thought when I was a kid I was going to grow up and be a college professor. But once I got to college, about the first week of college, I was like, oh, I want to do that. Yeah. My father was a history professor. I'm actually an English professor who studies cultural history. My main field of expertise is 16th century English and Italian literature, writers such as Shakespeare and so on. I just got back yesterday from the Shakespeare Association meetings in Los Angeles. So, but I was interested in the history and the literature. I was really interested in these things. I was interested in the languages. I love learning languages. I read in various languages and can speak a few. Italian, French, I speak pretty well and read quite well. I'm constantly trying to read better in Latin and Greek. They're more challenging for an English speaker than French or Italian. I have a little bit of Spanish. I'd like to have more. And yeah, it would be fun to have more time to study all these things. But the linguistic stuff helps, I think. And my passion for teaching came from my passion for the content. I'm really interested in this stuff, and I like to talk to people about it because I think a lot of people are interested. And it's fun to be able to share the things that I've learned with people who are interested, but maybe haven't had the time that I've had to learn since I'm a career scholar. I spend a lot of time reading and thinking about these things. That's a privilege I have, and it's nice for me to be able to share that with people as broadly as I can. And that's why I was excited to develop a course like this. Couple of other questions that came up, also sort of personal opinion things. One was, what's my favorite period? And oh, that's a real challenge. The period that I know the most about, as I said, I'm a scholar of the 16th century, and so which is just after the end of this course. That would be a fun course. We could maybe do that one next. I'll try and talk the GFA people into it. But the periods that we cover in this course, the ones that I have the most personal knowledge of are the Greek and Roman periods. That's because it feeds into 16th century Renaissance European culture in ways that I've been studying for years. But the period that interests me the most, I think, is the transitional period, the period when the Roman Empire is collapsing and Byzantium is rising and Islam is coming in as the new sort of exciting religion. That seems to me to be a period that's been understudied, partly because the records of it are scarcer. And it's a period of phenomenal change that I don't think we really understand. I've recently been reading books by scholars that are speculating about the role of disease and climate change in the collapse of the Roman Empire. Epidemic plagues and changes in climate. These are things that we're thinking about because they're challenges that we face. But it's interesting to think, people used to always think of the fall of the Roman Empire as something that was political. The political system collapsed, or there were too many immigrants from, Germanic tribes, or they were invaded by the Huns, or whatever it was. And that's all true. But why was the empire vulnerable then when it wasn't vulnerable earlier? And part of the answer to that may have to do with things like epidemic disease. And we'll talk about the Justinianic plague when we study Byzantium, and how that really, just as it looked like the empire was coming back, there was a horrific plague, which scholars now think was probably the bubonic plague, just like in the 14th century. But this was in the 6th century, and it killed, a third of the population, and really just took the wind out of everyone's sails. That weakened Byzantium at a point that made it very vulnerable to the rise of attacks by outside forces, one of which was Islam. Why was Islam as successful as it was? One of the answers is Byzantium was weak and was divided. And we'll talk about that when we get to it. So that's a period that I'm interested in because I don't know very much about it, and I'd like to know a lot more. And I think we, even people who study it as their main job would also like to know a lot more. It's a period where a lot of exciting scholarly work's being done now. So that early Middle Ages period is one that I find personally fascinating. Last question was about time travel. And it's where, when would you want to be for time travel? This is always a tricky question for me because a lot of the things that you're most interested in are also probably not very nice to, it would have been really impressive on some level to see the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in the 15th century, but really not a pleasant event. Many people being killed, et cetera, not a place you'd want to be. There's a old proverb that says, "May you live in uninteresting times," and that was a very interesting time. And I'm not sure, what you'd want. It would be fascinating. I do some work on theater, and so it would be fascinating. It would be fun to have been at the Globe Theater and seen a production, the first production of Hamlet. What was that like? And also ancient theater. What would it have been like to go to the Dionysia and see the first productions of Aeschylus, Oresteia, and things like that? What was it like? What was the experience that people had? Fascinating stuff. One of the things I think anybody who thinks about it for any length of time, to have met Jesus or Muhammad, just what were these people like if you actually met them without the sort of religions that grew up around them? What would your impression of them be as people? What would you think? Would you think this is the most amazing person I've ever met? This person, scares me, or this person seems strange to me? Fascinating stuff to think about, especially because both of these people, Jesus and Muhammad, we know that they existed historically, and we know that they were not powerful people in the traditional sense. They were not kings. They were not emperors. They were not Julius Caesar and Cleopatra and Alexander the Great. They were people of fairly modest background who have had arguably more influence on subsequent history than anybody else. And that's bracketing any questions about their relation to divinity, which, are going to be a matter for individual believers, but fascinating stuff to think about. Looks like we're out of time. Great questions. I hope you are enjoying the course. I hope you keep enjoying the course. We will be scheduling a second of these chats for later in the course. We don't have a date for it yet, but we'll get that set up in the next few days. And so if you have any questions for that chat, we'll soon get a discussion board set up, something to look for over the next week. So take care and keep enjoying the course. Bye.